Hi, my name is Chris Hilgert. I'm the Master Gardener Coordinator for the University of Wyoming Extension. It's warmed up enough today, we're going to transplant some plants out into the garden. Warm season plants are best started from seeds indoors prior to planting outdoors. Cool season plants like lettuce can be put in the ground when the soil is only about 40 degrees. Okra, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, squash. These are plants that prefer the soil be warmed up to closer to 60, maybe even 65 degrees before they go into the ground. So if we give them a head start indoors, they are going to produce that much sooner once we put them outdoors. And since we have such a short growing season, we'll take every advantage we can get in order to make sure that we actually do get to harvest our tomatoes and our peppers. Transplants are just young seedlings. They have leaves, a stem, and somewhat of an established root system. Don't grow them in the pots for too long though. You don't want them to become root bound before we get them into the soil. This might take years of practice to decide exactly how early we plant a particular vegetable each year before we get it out into the ground. And every year will be a little bit different, but there will be some consistency as far as how long it takes to get that plant to a stage where it's ready to go outside. Here we have your cotyledons and then two sets of true leaves. This is the perfect stage to transplant out into the garden. Before we actually plant this seedling in our garden, we need to help this plant acclimate to outdoor living conditions. Because it's been grown under some grow lights or in a protected location in a high tunnel or in a greenhouse, we would be in trouble if we just stuck this plant out in our garden. So to help this plant acclimate, what we want to do is first we'll just move it out into the shade for a few hours a day, and then gradually, day after day, expose it to more direct sunlight until finally this plant can survive in 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight in our garden. If you're purchasing transplants to put out in the garden, bigger isn't always better. When plants are grown under grow lights in a greenhouse or a high tunnel, sometimes they can become tall, leggy, and spindly. So the tallest plant isn't always the best one to choose. This is a great stage for your transplants to go out into the garden. They have at least 2 sets of true leaves. The internode space between those leaves is not so long that the plant is flopping over. It's standing upright on its own. This is a nice, tight, dense, compact plant that's ready to go in the garden. Just as spacing is important when we plant our seeds, it's also important when we put transplants in the ground. We want to maximize the space and use of our garden, but we also want to make sure that we give our plants plenty of room to grow. You know, right now these plants are small and we could put them in the ground this close together, but as these plants grow, they're going to compete with each other for light, space, water, and nutrients in the soil. So giving them enough space in between our plantings is important to give each individual plant what it needs to grow. What I like to do with my transplants is actually go out to the garden and set them out right where I'm going to plant them, and then I just go at it one at a time, putting them into the ground. Once again, you can find information on spacing for your transplants on the plant tag that came with it or on the seed packet that you started your plants with. A general rule when we're planting a container plant is that the soil level in the ground is the same level as the soil in the container. There are some exceptions to that rule, but keep in mind we don't want to plant our container plants too deep because we can actually suffocate the roots. And we don't want to plant too shallow and leave the top of the root ball exposed. The problem with that is that wicking occurs because oftentimes the soil in the container loses water faster than the native soil we're planting into. If we leave that exposed, that water in the root ball will just evaporate into the air and the root ball will dry out. So we want to make sure we dig a hole deep enough to allow room for this entire root ball, and that the native soil we're planting into will cover the root ball of this container soil with just a light layer of native soil to help prevent that wicking. You also want to be careful not to damage this plant getting it out of the container. Don't grab a hold of the stem and just pull on it. That can break the stem, break the roots, kill the plant before we even get it into the ground. Just carefully squeeze the pot a little bit just to loosen the soil, the root ball. Put our hand over the top of the container, flip it over, and hopefully that plant will just pop right out. Since I have my plants all spaced out, I just mark the hole with my shovel, set the pot aside, dig my hole, then I take the plant carefully out of the pot, move away any loose soil, hold it at about the right level for planting, and then just move the native soil back into the hole, making sure to cover that entire root ball. We don't want to pack it down. We want that soil to remain nice and loose to give those roots a chance to spread and grow out into the native soil. Again, just as we watered in our seeds after we plant them, we need to water our transplants or our seedlings as soon as we get them in the ground too. So I'm just going to use a hose, make sure I give the ground a good soaking. I'm going to direct the water right at the plant. Once it's starting to run off a little bit like that, I'm going to move on to the next one, letting that water soak in. I gave him one soaking, but I'm going to go back and give him another just to make sure that those roots are wet. But keep in mind that these roots are very shallow and these plants have a very small root system near the soil surface. And that's the part of the soil that dries out first and the quickest. So we do want to make sure that we water our plants in the garden religiously, keeping them moist but not saturated, and not letting them dry out between waterings. Now we've got our transplants in the ground. You just want to remember a few things. Choose varieties that are suited to growing at northern climates in a short growing season. Start them from seed indoors before moving in the garden, or purchase transplants for our warm season crops that have a long growing requirement. And use proper planting techniques. Carefully remove that plant from the pot. Dig a hole deep enough to hold that entire root ball. Cover that entire root ball with a light layer of soil over the top to prevent wicking or loss of water, and give that plant plenty of water so that it will thrive in the garden.